Had this elderberry log I split down the middle. I made one of these dough bowls by carving, and I thought I'd try another one by routing. And so I had to build a router jig in an ugly but accurate way to cut my opening in the log. In order to determine the size of the jig, I had to know the size of the hole I wanted, and then I needed to know the diameter of both my router bushing and my router bit in order to determine how much of a margin outside the opening that I needed to create in the jig to get the hole the size that I wanted. And after doing the math with a 1-inch outside diameter bushing and a 5/8 inch diameter router bit, that's a 3/8 difference, or on one side that's a 3/16 difference. So once I knew the size of the opening I wanted in the log, I just added 3/16 around the whole perimeter. Here's a diagram. 1-inch outside diameter bushing, 5/8 inch outside diameter router bit leaves a 3/16 gap between the router bit and the outside of the bushing. So once I knew those numbers, I transferred the numbers to a piece of 1/4-inch MDF to use as my ugly but accurate router jig. So I ripped it down the middle to a 7-inch width, so I had two reliable parallel edges to measure from, and then I simply started doing my measuring. First, I wanted to find the center of the board so that my spacing from each edge would be equal. Then I measured the width of the opening I wanted in the final cut through the log, and then I added 3/16 of an inch outside of each of those marks. Once I had those two marks determined, all I needed to know was how far was that 3/16 mark away from the edge of the 1/4-inch MDF. Once I knew that dimension, that's where I set my fence, and that would give me two perfectly parallel lines right on my finished width plus 3/16, if that makes any sense. So once I set my fence, I was able to just lower the blade, set the wood over it. I measured my length as well, so I knew where my overcuts had to get at least beyond X length, and I think I was at around 15 inches, so I made some marks. You can see them, and they don't need to be accurate because overcuts don't matter when you've got a 1-inch outside diameter bushing. You can have a pretty ugly corner and the bushing will still ride on it accurately. Clamped a piece of wood to the fence to just be sort of a hold down, just sort of a safety valve, even though 1/4-inch MDF doesn't put up much of a fight against the blade. I clamped a piece of wood to the fence, and then I put a piece of paper under that piece of wood before I clamped it down, so that when I withdrew the paper, I had a tight fit, but the MDF would still slide easily under the clamped piece of wood. Then I just positioned it so that as the blade rose out of the table, it would be at one end of the cut. And you'll see this in 2 seconds here. And as you raise the blade through that MDF, you'll see that it comes up very close to the top end of this cut. And as it comes out of the wood here, you'll see I only had to back it up maybe a couple inches, and then drew it forward as long as I got past the other end of my cut. That cut was finished. Then you turn it off, lower the blade, slide the piece of wood out from underneath that clamped piece of wood, flip it to the other side. Since I had measured accurately to the center of that 7-inch strip, my dimension against the fence was equal on both sides, and I was able to simply repeat that action. Did a little double checking there of my dimension, but I was able to just repeat that action on the other side of the jig. Again, place the piece of 1/4-inch MDF over where that blade rises out of my table. Just turn the blade on again, raise the blade up, backed it up a couple inches, and then finish that cut beyond my other end mark. And I had my 2 parallel lines cut in my jig. All that was left now was to rotate that 90 degrees. And in doing that, I used a smaller piece of wood clamped to the fence, and I also used my miter gauge just to have some support to hold that board 90 degrees to the fence so that I had a nice square opening. Raised the blade, pretty much the blade raised almost end to end. Had to finish maybe a 1/2 inch of that cut. And that was one end. Again, just simply lower the blade down, flip that board around, and I was able to raise the blade over the other end, and I had my finished jig size. Perfect 90-degree corners, parallel lines, and nice and light, 1/4-inch, just deep enough for the bushing on the router and the plunge router to ride on. And that gave me my ugly but accurate router jig. Just took that from the saw, went over to the log that I was working on. This I'd already planed, the top and the bottom, so I had flat parallel surfaces. I located that router jig over the opening. I had put pencil marks on the log, and so I knew where that router jig had to end up. I just kind of double checked all my edges to make sure I had it the proper size, and then I went ahead with here I'm just running the bushing around it just to kind of illustrate how this was going to work once that bushing was in my plunge router. Went with double-sided tape, taped it down in 4 different places. This double-sided tape I think works great, especially for something as light as 1/4-inch MDF. You don't have a lot of drag or resistance, and it stayed put throughout all the routing. And I had to plunge that router, an 1/8 of an inch per plunge, over 2 inches deep. So I had to run around this jig quite a few times, and there was just no movement because, again, a 1/4-inch MDF jig is nice and light, and it wants to stay put. And all that really is necessary is to have those straight lines and those square corners so that when the bushing rides around the jig, you get straight lines and 90-degree corners. You're going to end up with radiused corners at 5/8 inch or 5/16 inch radius because you have a 5/8 inch router bit. Here I set up my vacuum system to pick up as much of the dust as I possibly could. And here's just the first plunge. You can see the bit. It's plenty long, so I had a lot of depth left. And I just ran that router around the perimeter of the jig and sort of scoured out the center, and then just made pass after pass after pass, zigging and zagging and running back and forth. With a shallow cut like this, maybe 1/8 of an inch per cut, maybe 3/16 of an inch per cut, you can run that router when you're doing the center, hollowing the center out. You can run it around in a climb cut direction, and it really doesn't matter because you're not changing it that much. Then I just adjust my plunge router one more click on the depth adjustment and ran it again. One more click, ran it again. One more click, ran it again, etc. until I had reached the full depth of the bowl. I got a pretty clean cut. Admittedly, the corners, because of repeated going the same corner over and over again, I got a little bit of burning, and I was able to sand that off once the routing procedure was over. So you can see I again just kept making my passes. Here I'm zigging around. Then I would run basically around the center in a climb cut fashion. The router would kind of almost guide itself. You're constrained within the 1/4 inch MDF, so you really can't, unless you're really clumsy, you can't really have much of a runaway. And so I was able to just continually cut deeper and deeper. I think the adjustments on my router maybe go down maybe 3/16 per click. And after a while, I was down towards the depth that I was after. Here I am, almost at the bottom, still routing away. So I don't know how many passes total, but maybe 10 or 12, and I was down at the bottom of the bowl. Once I had the bottom depth that I wanted, the router did not leave me a super clean bottom with no ridges in it. It was hard because the router end is round, and so what I was able to do is just put a little sander on the end of my drill with some heavy grit paper, and I was able to sand the bottom smooth, even though the router didn't leave it perfectly smooth. It came pretty darn close. And you can see here that it's a pretty flat bottom. You can see there's a little burning in the corners. There is the almost finished bowl with no finish on it yet. I put some shellac on it, 2 or 3 coats of shellac, and then fine sanding at 220 grit, and then some paste wax, and I ended up with a quick little bowl using an ugly but accurate router jig. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe, and thanks again.